Ranked choice voting is pretty interesting because one of the arguments for it is that it tends to lead to less polarization and less candidates from the extreme wings of their parties winning. And interestingly, in New York City, which was probably before Alaska, the highest profile use of ranked choice voting, I was always a little worried about ranked choice voting because I thought it was so complicated. And most people don't really have opinions on 7 candidates deep or whatever. But it is the case that in the primaries in New York, it worked well, and that actually the most moderate of the candidates for mayor, Eric Adams, won. There's a lot to study there. I'll mention one reform which has not been particularly partisan, but which would have a pretty significant impact, which is automatic voter registration. We're one of the only countries, we all are used to this, we're one of the only countries where you have to register yourself to vote. And when you move, you fall off the rolls, and there's all kinds of shenanigans about that. That keep people off the rolls. And it's a system that was put in place a century ago to keep people from voting. And if you had automatic registration, in other words, everybody who's eligible is on the rolls, it would add about 50 million people to the rolls permanently and cost less. The Brennan Center, which I lead, as you know, developed the proposal for automatic voter registration over a decade ago. It's now the law in 17 states. It was in that legislation that almost passed Congress, and it has passed in Republican and Democratic states and purple states and on ballot initiatives. And it's made a big difference in getting people registered. Some of these kinds of very simple things can help build the bonds of citizenship and move it from being just a political plaything.
Yeah, amen to that, an automatic voter registration. I also think election day registration is a powerful potential reform, particularly for young people,
Right.
that our system systematically discriminates against young people because they move around a lot more.
And it
Than
doesn't
older.
help or hurt either party.
Right. But you just show up and with some proof and you can register, and it makes it participation is much higher in states that have election day registration. Sam, I bet you have some ideas on this front.
Yeah, I think it's hard to choose a single one, but I guess what I would say thematically is that the experience for voting in this country depends so much on sort of who you are, where you live, and it is not acceptable that in state after state, to choose 2 examples, Florida and Georgia, that Black voters who vote in person have to wait much, much, much longer than white voters. And there are a whole host of reforms that could be implemented. Some, these sort of big ticket things, and some are just about making sure that there are adequate numbers of polling places, that states cannot sort of discriminate in where polling places are located and how polling places are provided, making sure that there are enough days of early voting, all these sorts of things. Every American should be able to vote and should be able to vote easily. Nobody should be able to be in hotlines for hours and hours. Nobody should be forced to take time off of work and perhaps an hourly job so that they can participate in democracy. The bottom line is that voting really needs to be easy for everybody, and it fundamentally is not.
Right. The commission that President Obama appointed, a bipartisan commission, said to me, it was the most simple radical reform, which is no one should have to wait more than half an hour to vote. And most people don't. But the people who do usually have to wait a lot more. The other reform I like, which is now possible with computers, in Australia, you can vote at any polling place in your state. You can just go. And I think that we could make that a lot easier here. You could go near work. You could go when you're going to the mall. Well, we don't have malls anymore. They're closing down at a rapid pace. But when you're out shopping or something, there are different ways to do it. Congressman Castro, your favorite reforms, and Cecile.
Well, I'm going to go with something a little bit different, which is to finally end gerrymandering after all of these decades.
Amen. Yeah.
And, an independent redistricting commissions, and you would have to have one of those things where everybody unilaterally disarms at once, right? So they make sense. But it's been proven to work in both red and blue states. And that by itself would empower so many folks and would change the composition of Congress and would just create a fairer process for everyone.
Although you've seen states adopt it and then legislatures override it. How do you get it to stick? I mean, that hasn't happened everywhere. California's made it work, for example. But how do you
Right.
fight that?
I mean, there is a real temptation of politicians to draw their own districts. That's incredibly tempting for people to want to do. But really, that is a power that belongs to the electorate, to the people, and really shouldn't rest with the elected officials who really, whether you're Republican or Democrat, your first instinct is to preserve your electability. And that gets in the way of the rest.
Could I? Oh, go,
BJ,
Cecile, go ahead.
this is just like a piece of nice steak I need to get onto. And I want to point out that the United States Supreme Court, in the Rucho case, they elevated and held out the Florida's our Fair Districts amendments as the way to go. If states want to get rid of political gerrymandering, because that was the case where they said, we're not going to clean up your mess. If you're doing mess, don't come to the federal courts. We're not going to fix your political gerrymandering. And they said, if you want to fix it, look at the Fair Districts amendments in the state of Florida. And they actually cited a league case when we won, and we were one of the plaintiffs in the case with our allies. But they said, this is enforceable, this is clear, and this is what you should do. And so the people, as you had said earlier, had spoken on the issue of prohibiting racial gerrymandering, minority language-based gerrymandering, and political gerrymandering. And you're right, that is the status of state of the law, which the United States Supreme Court said, this is the way to go. So it would be interesting for me to see that same Supreme Court with a few different justices say, we're not going to enforce something that comes from the states that prohibits this, because they told us to do it just a few years ago. So I'm, curious about that. And of course, our governor provided his own version of a redistricting map, which directly violated the very Fair Districts and the Voting Rights Act and other things. And his excuse was, well, I think the law is going to change, and our legislators caved after a veto. And so we are in Florida, even though we have the Fair Districts amendments that the Supreme Court said were wonderful, we have, our governor and legislators basically cannibalizing the work of the citizens. So we are concerned, and we're in litigation on that issue also.